that order of loves needs to be set deeply at a young age.
Yes.
And that's what classical Christian education sets out to do. And what that boils up into is young men and women who have an ordered set of affections that collectively form a community. The communities collectively form civilization. And civilizations bless or they curse. So paideia, the strength of your building is only as good as the blocks you build it with. And that's what paideia is the building block of culture.
David, thank you so much for being with me today. I feel like you and I have such interesting conversations all the time. So I thought, let's actually get one on camera, But yeah, so thank you so much. It's always such a good time with you and always good conversing with you. So thank you for making it.
Well, the feeling's mutual. I know my trip to Africa was made exceptionally more interesting because of your ability to show me the local culture. So thank you.
Yeah. I mean, at the time that we're actually having this conversation, you and I think we met about 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And it's unbelievable to me, just the kind of friendship we've built the last couple of years. We've been in 2 different locations, 2 different continents, 2 different countries.
Yes.
And not just that, we've actually seen each other in various spots around the US as well, So that's been so much fun. The Africa tour was definitely interesting. All kinds of conversations on culture and education and all of that. So yeah,
We'll get you to write all this down sooner or later.
It has to happen as long as you co-author it.
Really, you have got a lot of material for a great book. I hope you get that out soon.
I will see what happens. Your encouragement always means a lot to me in that regard. So thank you. So of course, you wrote the book Battle for American Mind. When was this published? About 4 years ago at this point?
2022.
Okay, 2022. Yeah, 3 years ago. You did it alongside some guy, I forget his name now. You wrote this alongside Pete Hegseth. My greatest surprise this year is, Hegseth got the SecDef position, and I'm fully expecting you to come right alongside him as like his deputy or something like that. I mean,
Well, maybe if he had been the Secretary of Education, but
maybe so.
My knowledge of the defense industry is pretty limited.
Yeah. I get that. Well, speaking of Department of Education, there's been an interesting shakeup since Trump came into the White House. Linda McMahon's now the Secretary of Education, and I think the play is supposed to be to shut down the Department of Education. Just in your opinion, how feasible do you think that is? Is that possible?
Well, it'll depend a lot on the midterms. I don't think they're going to try and get it done until the midterm elections. If they can get enough seats in Congress to repeal, it was put in place, of course, by a congressional act. So I don't believe there's a way for the executive to close it unless Congress goes along. And but there's certainly, it's kind of like a moving party over there. They're selling off all the furniture, moving stuff out. Our organization works occasionally with a federal organization called the NAEP. I think it's our NAES. It's a statistics gathering organization, and I think it got moved to the Census Department. So they're kind of shuffling things around. They're certainly preparing to sell the house. We'll see if Congress lets them.
Yeah, certainly. One of the things that I've noticed in recent times is in Florida, there seems to be a push towards classical education in some of its curricula at a public school level. Mm-hmm. Is this a good idea? Can this really work? Is this what it takes to save America?
Well, the problem is going to be that the concept of pluralism is still alive and well, and they're trying to keep Christianity out of it. Yeah. And I think a lot of people mistake classical education. There's not one classical education. There's at least 3 that I would track. Mm-hmm. And the one that you can perform in a public school setting is really just a great book sort of approach where you're reading a great text. You may learn some logic and rhetoric in the same context that maybe ancient Rome would have, or some of the more progressive areas of the United States did in the late 19th century. That's a very different kind of classical education than classical Christian education. And people sometimes think that classical Christian education is just the addition of a Christian sort of religious frosting on top of an otherwise classical cake. And that's not the way it is. It doesn't work that way.
Right. How can you just flesh that out for me? Like, what are the distinctives of classical Christian education as opposed to, when contrast with just a classical education?
Yeah. Well, the easiest way I think to see it is to go back and say, really, just use 3 points in time and say these are the 3 different ways classical education has been. The first was the Greeks and the Romans. Of course, the Greeks practiced it first, passed it on to the Romans. The Romans trained in the grammar, logic, and rhetoric. They didn't call it the trivium. They just called it grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And that form of education was fairly intact until somewhere between 500 and 800 AD. And of course, education wasn't universal at the time, but the people who were educated, that's how they were educated, was in the old Roman form. By 800 AD, that form had died out. And in around 1050 to 1100, a new form rose. And the new form of classical education was deeply Christian, because it was born of an interest. We recall Anselm's. Saint Anselm was a saint in 1080 is about when he starts writing, and his famous axiom was that he does not understand so that he may know God. He knows God so that he may understand. And there's a lot more wrapped up in that wrapper than we realize. The picture of education he creates is that there's an epistemology for the $2 word, or just a way of coming to know things that can be used to bring forth the kingdom of God. And you see just about every major institution and idea set that formed the Christian West, which is the West. Yes. The West is not, despite what people think, a product of Greece and Rome, although they certainly influenced it. It's a product of medieval Christianity. And so that form of education, that's when they started calling it the trivium, or the 3 ways. And then there was the quadrivium, which in Latin means the 4 ways. You ask, ways to what? Ways to know. How do we come to know things? Because if we can come to understand things, to know things, we can apply that to our governments, to our families, to our churches, to our institutions, and our just everything becomes a piece of the Christian kingdom. Then the Enlightenment happens. They tell a new story. The new story says, oh, that really wasn't the medievals who did all that great knowing, because obviously that's what marks the West, is the great knowledge that the West developed. It's not really the medievals that sparked it. That was humanism, born in the Greece and Rome, and then just rediscovered in the Renaissance, or reborn, as they say, in the Renaissance. And so by the 19th century, classical education had shifted to a humanism base. And what that means is they strip out the key axiom of classical Christian education, which is that theology is the queen of the sciences. Yeah. That the linchpin or the kingpin in all of the method of classical understanding is that the crown is the study of theology. And if you go back even to 1700s, the greatest colleges at Oxford or University of Paris or Bologna or any of those were the theology departments. That's where all the action happened. If you were in the natural sciences, you were in sort of the backwater, right? Yes. You were and also ran. And then, of course, by the Enlightenment, they changed that, flipped that around, and then pretty much now, I don't know what kind of a theological education you even get at Oxford, but I know it's still a big department there. But the bottom line that I'm trying to say is these charter schools that they're in Florida or anywhere, if you take Christ out of it, you're not just taking the frosting off. You're taking the ingredients out, the way we come to know. And so it's not even really the same category of thing.
There's I think when once you take theology out of things, you lose a cosmological vision for things.
Well said.
Yeah, because God really is the sovereign who rules over absolutely everything, because he is omniscient, and because he's actually the one who determines and defines what true epistemology is. We're just never really going to understand the world in the way we should without theology anchoring that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that certainly needs to be recovered. In the last season of this show, I sat down with Vishal Mangalwadi and kind of was interrogating a similar line of thought. And his thesis that I largely agree with was, him talking about the intellectual surrender of the church when they decided to pull away from the university and essentially siloed themselves into seminaries. When you think about all the great reformers, you think about influential Christians over time, they all had this classical Christian education, and they were all men of the university. But now seminary and theology as a distinct discipline has kind of been siloed into academic corners that has, at least in people's minds, no bearing on the rest of life. And of course, his goal is to try to see that reconciled, where seminaries can recover that holistic cosmological vision for all things and recover their voice in the public square. That's what he'd like to see happen. So I hope that happens.
Yes, I think pluralism, I mentioned that a minute ago. We don't realize how crafty and how destructive pluralism is as an idea. It would be interesting to explore the idea a little bit, because as I understand it, it comes into play, there are a lot of religious wars. There's a lot of contention between states, some of which may be Catholic, others Protestant, others. And so, I guess what I would call the most graphic case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. They don't attack, in pluralism, they don't attack religion or Christianity. They just move it to a safe space, which is basically no place. And that's the beginning of the end for the West, in my view.
It's taking Christ out of the Christianity.
Yep. Taking Christ out of Christianity, taking Christ out of basically everything, marginalizing him. And the thing is he says he's the way, the truth, and the life. Those are the only three things, what we do, the way, what we see as truth, and how we live. You take all that out of Christianity, and you basically have denied the essential reality of who Christ is.
Yeah, right. So let's say people hearing us have this conversation, and they might say a hearty amen to all of this, but they might be wondering, okay, what does this actually look like in pedagogy, for example? What does this look like in a classroom setup? Like, we love this idea of Christ being the center of things, theology being the queen of the sciences. But how does this influence the way that we then teach and learn?
Well, I think if we go back to the medievals, for the first thing, we have to realize that the project of education is the art of learning itself. And when I first heard that, I think, like everyone, I gave it too little credence. I didn't, how hard can it be to learn something? But I had a modern mind, and the modern mind was saying learning is just a function of scientific experimentation, right? Just read a book, read another book, see if they align. It's all done in here. That's human rationalism, and it's not the way that Christians come to know things. Christians create an ordered hierarchy. So we have the trivium, which is grammar, logic, rhetoric, the three things that train. And for Christians, rhetoric was different. When you get into the Middle Ages, it's not the Roman rhetoric of political discourse. It's discourse brother to brother in the search of the truth. And it can involve speeches. It does involve that sort of thing, but it's mostly not to win the day in the political sphere. It's to come to a knowledge of the truth together. Come, let us reason together. And so you get this more sophisticated version of rhetoric. There's a more sophisticated version, or Christian, sophisticated is the wrong word, more Christian version of rhetoric, more Christian version of the dialectic. Of course, the medievals were great logicians. They would work through the logic of things. Right. So you take that, you layer the theologies of the Queen of the Sciences on top of it, and then you take what Thomas Aquinas told us about synthesis, that only in a Christian, in any pagan world, you can't have synthesis because you got multiple gods. And so any truth can only be a truth insofar as you don't switch gods out, right? Yeah. Very different for a Christian. There's only one God. Christ reigns over all. So that makes everything work together. So you asked kind of a question about how's it different pedagogically, and I would say that whole envelope of grammar, logic, rhetoric, theologies of Queen of the Sciences, wrapped in a sort of a synthesis, trying to bring everything together so that in the university was an invention of the medieval Christians for this purpose of bringing things that we can know together. The outworking of that was many institutions that we now hang on. So if you look at American legal system, it's quite a miraculous thing when you look at it, how it works. The idea of juries and judges, the idea of a trial, the way the trial works, how, what is legal and illegal in property law or in contract law, all of that dates into what's often pointed to as British common law. But British common law descended from ecclesiastical law from the Middle Ages, and that's where it was really generated. And when you look at it, all of these laws really come down to Christian principles of law. Yes. How do we treat someone who commits a crime? How do warring nations justly work within the context of a just war theory? How does a property right pass from one generation to the next? Is it something that can be sold? Is it the divine right of the king? I mean, there's all kinds of things that were meted out, figured out, and parsed once they had developed a way of knowing.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's profound. I wish more people would actually grasp that. And we certainly need a lot more of that. And yeah, I think America in that sense is just so different and distinct than most countries around the world in that regard as well. It was applied in a unique way, I think, building on that tradition as well. Turns out biblical law, Christian law, is good for the world. Mm-hmm. Who would have thought, right?
Yes, I mean, imagine where we'd be if instead of adopting pluralism and jettisoning Christianity, the Christians would have continued the process of working together, Catholics, Protestants, all the various Orthodox, the various forms, working together to come to a knowledge of truth to continue building the West. What we see is that pretty much throughout the 20th century, the West is falling into decadence. Yes. Yeah. And we can't just assume that that's the natural outworking. Ideas have consequences. Right. That flows from this pluralistic idea that Christianity has to be taken out of public discourse, and that way of knowing has to be sanitized down to scientific learning. You take those two ideas and you can see exactly what destroyed the West.
Exactly. One of the things that I've observed about the West as well, and this is largely, I think, concentrated in Europe, but I think the West has lost its will to fight. It's lost its faculties of discernment regarding what is good, what is evil, who are we, what are we for, how do we resist the rot, what does it look like to build civilization in a way that is anchored in virtue. I think it's lost some of those fundamental sensibilities. We're now, as the West is crumbling, it's crumbling in its freedoms. It's crumbling in its prosperity in many ways. And some people are disillusioned about it all. They have no idea how this is happening. Some also just don't frankly care or even have the categories to discern what's actually happened. And of course, I think that's a consequence of just throwing God out of the equation entirely. That's what happens when a nation abandons God. Mm-hmm. To what degree do you think education has contributed to that? Like I mean, you speak about the Enlightenment, but it's just amazing and shocking to me just how quickly education has been eroded. I mean, part of your rationale for writing Battle for the American Mind was because you were concerned about the state of education in America.
Well, originally, I had heard a lecture that just had a quote from a progressive educator in the early part of the 20th century, where he said that the parents didn't have the right to control the plasticity of the child. And that was an odd word. Of course, in the early 20th century, they were using more diverse vocabulary than we now do. But I went to find out what that meant. I knew what plasticity in that context must mean, but what were they actually trying to achieve? And that's when I unraveled what much to my surprise, that the progressives, this was not, I guess I had always thought it was just a natural, slow progression away from the Christian worldview and towards sort of a progressive America. But it was an orchestrated, intentional act by the progressives to upend classical Christian education, which had dominated even into the late 19th century. It was still the dominant ethos in schools, the way things were learned. And in 1905, they started a lab school called the Gary School in Gary, Indiana. That turned into the Gary Plan that they imported into other states. And by 1915, they had a strategy to move forward and get Christ out of schools all across America. The problem they had is that Gary was unique because Gary was a relatively small town at the time because it was brand new. It was an industrial town right on the shores of Lake Michigan. And so it was fairly new and they could do whatever they wanted there. Most of the people there were workers, blue collar. And then in the big cities, they had a liberal stronghold, but getting it out into the rural areas and into the rest of America was going to be very hard because these were Christian areas. And prior to this, you had in many of these areas, you had the Apostles' Creed being recited every morning, at least before 1905. And you had Christian work going on in the classroom all the time. So how do you get that out? Well, they knew that they couldn't just yank it out because local people still controlled the school boards and it would never happen. So what they did is we use a story in the book of, those spy dramas where there's a precious gem on a plate and in a museum and somebody's wanting to steal it, but they have to put something just like it on the plate or same weight, same look, so that no one will notice it's gone to give them time. And what that gem was in this case was American patriotism. So you see the rise of the Bellamy Salute, which prior to 1942 was a different salute than prior to 1952. It didn't have "Under God" in it, but it was meant to replace the Apostles' Creed. The flag in front of the class replaced the crosses. The pictures of George Washington replaced any Christian paraphernalia that was in the room. And they were off to the races. It was their intention to trick the American people into letting Christ go in favor of patriotism. And that's the sad thing is that even patriotism is a bad substitute for Christ. Exactly. It doesn't work. And it drove us into the 1950s where we had a very patriotic population, but not a very godly one, at least not in a spiritual sense. And that led to the decay that we see. So,
yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's. I've been thinking quite a bit about patriotism the last couple of years and thinking like, what are the core ingredients that make patriotism virtuous, and where does it get dangerous? And one of the things that I started to muse through is the correlation between truth, beauty, and goodness, which I think are very distinctly Christian ideals, and patriotism. I think American patriotism really is unique. Americans might be the most patriotic people on planet Earth. And I think that's because they really do have a strong foundation. There's an abundance of liberty and prosperity over time. And people love that and they want to defend that. But I think what I've noticed is in civilizations that loosen those hinges, they lose a grasp of what truth is. They redefine what beauty is and replace that with distortion. They think of goodness as a relative thing. And all of a sudden, your patriotism becomes quite empty. Like, you're not even really defending virtue anymore. You're defending the sentimentality. It becomes a sentimental thing, and that's all it amounts to. So as you're saying that, I'm just musing through this and thinking like, is that what we're seeing here? Is that what happened? But yeah, that's a quite a profound observation.
Yes, I think in some sense, the strength of American patriotism is due to its ideology. It was an ideological experiment.
Right.
And it wasn't the only one. There were other ideologies.
Right.
There was communism and Marxism.
Right.
There was what has become in the 20th century a liberal democracy. The idea of each man can, you could not get away with most of the sexual deviancy that we see today in the 19th century in America. It's not that they were less committed to liberty. It's that liberty meant something different. Liberty was the pursuit of the good life as defined by Christ, as defined by God. Mm. And then that got shifted along with that same sort of the shuffle of the diamond, they'd move everything elsewhere. I think, that patriotism to an ideology is what we see, particularly in the early part of the 20th century in communism. I'm a little hesitant to recommend books because everybody does that too much, but there's an old book called Witness by a guy by the name of Whittaker Chambers. He was involved he was a Communist Party member helping move, in the United States, helping to move state secrets out to Russia. And he testified, in this trial, and that's where this witness comes from. But he became a Christian. And the beginning of that book tells an amazing story of communism. And he goes through all the possible ways people think communism is. And he lands on, it's none of these. It's a religion. It's an ideology. Yes. It's a religion based in ideology. That's right. And I'd never really thought about the fact, because I just recently picked up the book, never really thought about the fact that ideologies make bad religions.
Yes, right.
Because they're very human-centric, right? It gives the human the power. And that's the problem we're in, is if we're highly patriotic to an ideology, it's going to yield some downstream problems every time.
Yeah, as we're seeing now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And by that, I mean, I guess I'm being a little nebulous. I should say, if something is right or wrong based upon what the God of the universe says, and we may debate, maybe for a Catholic, or a Protestant, right? Is contraception biblically allowed? Right. Those kinds of debates are acceptable and good to have, mainly because you're all working from the same, not ideology, but from the same basis of truth in Christianity and in the Bible. Mm. Without the Christianity and the Bible, you don't have the West. you don't even get close to it.
Exactly.
And I think one of the weak spots for modern men, certainly I'm there as well, is the inability to imagine what the world would be like without Christianity.
Right. Exactly. That's actually been one of the things that in my time living in the United States is just how influenced the non-Christians are by Christianity. Like, they don't understand how Christian they are. They really can't imagine a world that hasn't been influenced by Christianity. It's inescapable. The service delivery they expect that's good and timely and honest. The fact that there's sidewalks on the side of every street. And you know that's profound to me. You've seen what Zambia is like, right? Those are all things people can easily take for granted, but those are fundamentally Christian distinctives.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most profound experiences I had when I was in Zambia with you is that you'd put me in a home with some people for afternoon dinner.
Yes.
These were Christians. By the way, I found all Zambians that I met to be joyful, just very enjoyable people. But as we were eating, they were talking about how difficult it is to conduct life in the tribal conduct or context with their Christianity, because they were talking about their daughter being married and what that involved, and how the tribal practices were different. And in short, it was my first time to ever realize, wait a minute, the world doesn't all think like Americans.
Right.
It was the problems they had were very foreign to me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and what it boils down to is just the degree to which Christianity influences any given nation is going to determine how free it is, and even how prosperous it's going to be. I think in much of the third world, the reason the third world is what it is because it doesn't have that Christian influence in that way. I mean, sure, missionaries have gone all across the third world at this point for a few centuries. But at best, I think they've often preached a very narrow-minded gospel. It's really about trying to get people to punch their tickets to heaven and not really teaching a cosmological vision of what Christianity really is, the implications of what the gospel produces. And we need to recover that. And I think where those gaps exist, as you've observed, usually you're going to get some pagan, secular alternative that fills those gaps. And that's why in much of the third world, syncretism, that pluralism to a degree is a real thing, where people actually think these disparate worldviews, contrasting worldviews can actually coexist. And it just doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And that can only really be remedied, I think, with a robust Christianity, which is why I love classical Christian education. I really do think it's that tool that actually will help to move that needle a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. President of New St. Andrews wrote a book. It's one of my favorite books ever. Yeah. I maybe should qualify that a bit more, but a very good book. The White Horse King. Yeah. And I commend it to everyone because you can see little glimpses of how Christianity changed pagan cultures right in that book.
Yes, exactly.
One of the classic cases is that when the Danes take over England or parts of England and the locals are trying to figure out how to fight them, they finally band together and are able to conquer these invaders. But the invaders live, at this point, they're living in England. And so the question is, what do you do when you conquer a people like that? Now, historically, you sell everyone into slavery, or you kill them, or you take their women and you marry. Mm-hmm. That was like the way that every society throughout time, when you won a war, that's what you did. And when you think about it, it wasn't just barbarism, it was practical. Right. If you let these people, go back to their homes, you're going to be fighting them again in a few weeks. So you don't let them go back. You just upend them. Alfred the Great comes up with a Christian answer. which is, no, I'm going to baptize you. Now, modern Christians are like, what? You can't force a guy to be baptized.
Right.
No, we're going to baptize you and you're going to live by Christian rules. You can keep living here and you can do your thing, but you're going to do it in a Christian context. We're going to be brothers. We are not going to be waiting for you to come invade us again. And that just in itself, just in a microcosm, is a picture of how Christianity changed the world, is that it sees people not as, us and them. It sees people as image of God bearers. Therefore, there's got to be a better solution than killing them and enslaving them.
Right, exactly.
And that, works its way through into just war theory and everything that comes later.
Well, so much for multiculturalism,
Yeah. Well, there's this is a funny thing. As you see Europe, this is a question people should be asking who ask questions about multiculturalism. Yeah. They act as though Europeans are this monolithic group. Right. But if you go back to the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages particularly, the Romans could never conquer north of basically, I think, the Rhine, because that Germanic culture was so difficult. They couldn't deal with it. Yeah. The Gauls were difficult to deal with. The Picts, the Celts. I mean, these were some of the most diverse people groups in the world. I mean, you go over there today and you see the Stonehenge type, Druid worshiping. This place was diverse. Right. And yet now we're criticized, Europeans, for being a monolith.
Right. Yeah.
But yet, there are 15, 20 different languages across the Eurasian, Western Asian. It's not a monolith. It's just united because Christianity united it about 1,500 years ago. And yet now we're told that the way to unite diverse populations is to let them all be diverse. Right. Don't unite them around any particular truth system.
Yeah, exactly.
Let them have their own truth. Yeah. And that doesn't create a society, that creates strife.
Right, precisely. And I think behind that as well is just this assumption that culture is always neutral.
Yes.
And therefore there's not one culture that's better than the other. All you have to do is just travel the world a little bit and you'll realize very quickly.
Well, I like the way you said that culture is always neutral. Yeah. Using a superlative. Yeah. The flip side is actually the truth. Right. Culture is never neutral. It's never neutral. Exactly. It's never, ever neutral. Yeah. And, this was, one of my favorite moments last year was when J.D. Vance pulled the Ordo Morris thing on national television. It's like, this is one of the central truth claims of Christianity, is that all things are ordered. Exactly. And God orders them according to his will, whatever he chooses. And when you look at cultures, some of them are better and some of them are worse because of the way they order their loves within the culture. Exactly. And so you have Eastern culture in the Asian space that obviously has some strengths over some other parts of the world. They aren't by any means a Christian culture, but their order of affections, their love of their parents and their ancestors, those sorts of things play some truth. There's some truth to it. I think we've got to get back to the place where Christians see our job as blessing the world by bringing them Christ.
Absolutely. What do you think that'll take to bring people to a point where they can appreciate that, live by it, and seek to promote and propagate it?
Excellent question. And of course, I only have one answer because it's my job. Yeah. Education. Yeah. And education is not salvific. I'm not talking about individual salvation. What I'm talking about is that order of loves needs to be set deeply at a young age. Yes. And that's what classical Christian education sets out to do. And what that boils up into is young men and women who have an ordered set of affections that collectively form a community. The communities collectively form civilization. and civilizations bless or they curse. So paideia, the strength of your building is only as good as the blocks you build it with. And that's what paideia is the building block of culture.
Let's unearth this a little bit. Paideia, it's a Greek term. What I often understand by it is this idea of enculturation, this appeal to the whole being of a person, appealing to their affections, their mind, absolutely everything, seeking to conform them to the image of some standard or ideal. For the Greeks, that was about trying to produce a good, I suppose, virtuous Greek citizen. So would you simply say that it's the same thing in that regard, but what we're trying to orient students around is the virtue of being Christ-like? How would you unpack that idea of paideia?
I think the easiest way to understand paideia is to understand how it came to be known. It's really a concept. It's a reality, but it's a concept because it was given a name by the Greeks. And it begins in Athens. And, the Athenians were great at thinking about things. And, of course, they were always warring with the city-states around them and some foreign powers, whether it's the Persians or the Italians or the Spartans or the Macedonians. The Athenians were always warring around. And they asked a question, what makes a Macedonian a Macedonian? What makes a Spartan a Spartan? They're different kind of people. You only have to watch, the 300, and you see the Spartans were a very different kind of people. And they noticed that if you took a child, a baby as an infant, and took them out of one of these cultures and put them in another, it wasn't genetic. They grew up to be like the culture they were put in. And so they anticipated that they wanted to create a new form of government that didn't involve tyrants because, as we know from Plato's Republic, the Greeks were very interested in the understanding of why tyrants rise and how to, because it makes for very bad government. And their idea was democracy. What if we have a democracy where there's no one person with this power? And the question that was raised was, with all these paideias, they all share one thing in common. They revere the leader. Whoever the king is, they're brought up as an infant to revere that person. So they're brought up in a servile way. They're brought up to serve the king. If we're going to have a democracy, we need to figure out how to liberate these children from this idea that you have to serve the king. And the way we do that is we teach them to think for themselves, because then we can have debates and dialogues in the public square. That was the basis of the Athenian democracy originally, and that's where paideia was born. The liberal arts were born there, like grammar, logic, rhetoric, geometry, all the other elements. The philosophy of the Greeks was born out of this idea of paideia, training young children to think liberally, meaning free. And of course, the Romans developed further. The Christians really developed it in the Middle Ages. We already talked about that. And what it is just training children to order their affections, so that if you're brought up to seek truth, but you realize that the ultimate source of truth is Jesus Christ and God the Father, God the Holy Spirit. You're brought up to order the Trinity correctly. You're brought up to order your family correctly. Everything is rightly ordered. That's a big part of paideia, is rightly ordering how you love the world. Another aspect of paideia is the myth or the narrative that you think about the world. Most kids that are running around today who weren't brought up in the church, or some that were brought up in the church, their myth is about apes turning into people, and that, we think of that and think, oh, that's just a scientific theory. Everybody lives in a story. I mean, yeah. I'm interested. What do you think the most destructive myths are that are either in your homeland or in America as you've seen it, that people just live in this story and they don't realize that it's a false story.
Yeah. I think there's a sequence of things I could think to that. One is that man is the center of the universe. So we're all in our own stories where each one of us is a main character.
Excellent point.
Right? I think largely God is dismissed from that story by and large. That the greatest problems in this world are problems of disparity rather than sin. And I mean financial disparity, that differences are the great evil in this world. I think that's a narrative I hear that's very prevalent. You've already touched on this, but government is God is another prevalent narrative that I think has been very destructive. And I think another one is just a very entropic view of what life is all about. And by entropic, I mean, actually the better word is fatalistic. That the world's going to hell anyway, so let's just do whatever we want.
Hedonism.
Yes, it really is hedonism. And even as far as people try to build this idea of utopia, it's still quite shallow, you know. The crescendo of the world's narrative is still very cheap. And I think these are a few things that I see as far as the world's narrative. Yeah.
No, that's great. So Paideia, it's got three elements. One is this ordered affections, what we love and in what order. One is the myth or the story that we're in and what it means to, what our part is in that story. And the third is what sometimes people call worldview, but it's really just a set of basic assumptions you make about things every day. When I walk into a store in the United States, I put my money or credit card, I guess, down on the table, and I anticipate getting what is on offer. That's a worldview-based thing that the guy across the counter is interested in my good as much as his own in the transaction, and isn't selling me a hollow shell or something. Now, of course, there's cheats everywhere, but as you pointed out, it's a worldview thing. So those three things in Paideia, the assumptions we carry with us about the world, the affections we have, and the myths that we're in, pretty much shape Paideia.
Right. Wow. Where would you begin with trying to reorder that? Like very practically, how do we begin to propose a truthful narrative? How do we push that forward?
Very young, read your kids the old Western stories. You would be shocked at how I tell a story sometimes. When my son was about 5 or 6, he's a thinker. This one,
yeah.
I have 2 sons. He's a thinker, and I had been reading him great Western stories for a long time. Grimm's fairy tales.
I was going to ask you, like, what is some of your favorites to read there? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my favorites are all George MacDonald. Okay. Every George MacDonald book that are for kids. He writes a couple of adult novels, are just amazing in their way of communicating truth. So I picked up 101 or 1001 Arabian Nights once and started to read a story out of there. And we get to the end of the story, and the basic plot of the story was that there was this lion that was walking around, and he kept encountering different animals who'd been abused by this thing called man, and how terrible it was. And he set out to find this thing called man and punish it for what it was doing to all these animals. And he comes across this animal that is so abused, the hair has been worn off his whole body except the top of his head. And which, of course, it's a man. And the man, he says, yeah, they made me row their boat. They did this, they did that. And the lion says, what can I do for you? And he says, build me a house. So the lion builds it to his specifications. The man goes in with the lion and then steps out, slams the door, and it's a lion trap, right? And my son started crying at that moment. And we had read, Grimm's fairy tales. I mean, there's death, there's torture. I mean, everything's in the. I'm going, what is so bad about this? And I asked him, I said, why are you upset about the end of this story? I said, lots of people die and things die in these stories. And he goes, it's not that, Dad. It's that the lion was just sneaky, or the man was just sneaky.
Yeah.
The virtue of the story was that he was sneaky. Being clever made you good. That's a very non-Christian cultural influence. And that's where, if you want your kids to grow up, the first thing, to love the good, the true, and the beautiful, read them good, true, and beautiful stories over and over and over again. Read the Chronicles of Narnia at least 3 times before they're in the 3rd grade.
Absolutely. That's the way to do it.
That's one way. And there's the other is just straight biblical depth. Don't just read the verses, read the narrative of Scripture, because that narrative sets better affections than you can ever even do with fairy tales. And then in your home, you just need to, this is the funny thing is I work for a school network, but it's parents who have the biggest influence on the paideia of their children. As a school, what we can do is we can deepen and make a richer paideia of what you do, but we cannot make the base of what it is. That comes from the home. It's how you live. It's do you hold your kids to high standards? And when you, as a parent, fall short of those standards, do you confess your sin to your children? And do they see that, that wholly enveloping Christian worldview in your home?
Yeah, so good. One of the things that was very integral in my upbringing was just catechesis as well. My parents did an excellent job catechizing me. And recently I've been thinking about what makes catechesis so potent. And it's interesting because kind of taking this back to the trivium, I think catechesis actually teaches you both grammar, logic, and rhetoric all at once. You're learning what things are, who God is, who we are. Logic, you're helping them think through interrogation. They're learning to ask the right questions, and then in rhetoric, they're also learning to answer questions. And I mean, I didn't even think about it when I was growing up. It's really in my adulthood that I really appreciated this. But I realized that, wow, from the time I was young, I've had this ability to answer questions, and you can even say existential questions about the meaning of life for people who might seem confused on those kinds of things. And so I've thought that catechesis is very powerful that way. But then connected to it, and I've really wanted your thoughts on this. In dealing with the trivium in this way, people like to sometimes sequence it as like stages of learning, as opposed to not so much stages of learning, but as something that actually comes together as a whole at every stage of a student's life. How do you generally like to think of the trivium in that sense?
Well, I think the trivium is a complete set.
Yeah.
The short answer would be, the classical movement got its start with Dorothy Sayers, and she made that observation about, she had 3 stages, and she said, gee, they overlay these 3, grammar, logic, rhetoric. Historically, grammar had always been started for young children, and logic and rhetoric were kind of grouped together in the secondary. I think they work together better than they work separately. They aren't phases that you go through. They are a complete set of tools you use the way, as I said earlier, the way you come to know things. And so I think that rhetoric, it does have an ordering to it. The dialectic and the rhetoric are superior to the grammar. The rhetoric is superior to the dialectic, because what rhetoric is doing is synthesizing. And so you're drawing truth together. So I do think it's better to see it as a set of arts. That's the other thing I often talk about with regard to the trivium. These are arts, which means that they're human practices. They aren't subjects. They aren't, you can't read a book on dialectic and be a good dialectician. You have to practice it. It's, I was a little nervous when you go into the doctor's office and he calls himself a practice. I'd rather he not practice on me, but practicing the art of thinking is in the same category.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, complete sense. Of course, one of your big role is you're the president of the Association for Classical Christian Schools. How many schools are in the ACCS?
We have about 550.
It's amazing. Yeah. On average, how many schools do you add a year?
Well, that varies year to year. On average, it'd probably be around 30 or 40, but we had a big boom between 2023 and 2024. A couple of hundred schools added. It's found its own. And that's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about making it clear to people that classical Christian education is not just a hair's breadth away from classical education or great books education. It's a whole different thing. Its difference is not just the Bible. That's part of it, but that's not it. Its difference is the whole way it works.
Yeah. What has encouraged you most as you've seen classical Christian education continue to grow? The other side of it that I want to know is just what things are you concerned about, if anything?
Well, it's exciting. We did a study called the Good Soil Study where we tracked people for age 24 to 44 who had been to a classical Christian school and compared them to other types of schools. And it's quite an interesting study. You can find it at classicalchristian.org. There were 7 categories that we broke the answers into, and the essential outcome was that they were substantially different than people educated in other forms of education. So that is the positive side. I think on the threat to any success is success itself. You start losing some of the people like to grab hold of something successful and make it their own, and they label it classical, but then they say, but the way we do it is this. And to a good degree, classical education is not a prescribed curriculum or a very particular pedagogical form, but it's a set of principles that are pretty well established in the Middle Ages. Yeah. I think the biggest threat is that we're going to lose some of that effectiveness, because once you step away from the form that the Middle Ages gave us, you step away from a Christian form. And humanism yields ugliness, and really effective humanism yields really effective ugliness. And classical schools that do not, the term is often thrown around, you might make clever devils.
Yes.
You might, or you just might make some very effective humanists who will look like devils.
Right. Yeah, well said. Something else I want to ask you here is, sometimes I've had opportunities to speak on classical Christian education. Interesting enough, I think I've had a couple of opportunities to speak about some of the pitfalls of classical Christian education, which, I'm sold out on classical Christian education. But one of the pitfalls that I sometimes encounter, I'll bring up 2. One is basically a tendency among some students to be anachronistic, where they're perpetually living in the past and understand much about the history of the world, you can say the history of Christianity, but seem somewhat impotent to actually build culture today. They live in the archives, but they don't know what to do with that. That's one thing I sometimes observe. The other thing, and personally, I've seen this to a lesser degree, but it's something I still observe, is how sometimes it could tickle the gray matter, so to speak, of students, and they're kind of confined into this nerdish silo that I think for boys especially can make them somewhat effeminate. I don't know how else to put that. Would you share some of these similar concerns? If so, how do we address this? How does classical Christian education deal with these things, or how ought it to deal with these kinds of things?
No, you're right on point. I think I share both those concerns. I think they're related to what I said, but they're very much better stated. I mean, you're putting them out there. The first of the two, it's a problem of telos, the fancy Greek word, but purpose is what we might say. One of the 19th century artifacts that got pushed into classical education was that, okay, the original classical education its purpose was to take every thought captive to Christ,
Yes.
right? But we aren't doing that in a pluralistic society in the 19th century. So what are we doing it for? Well, the artifacts of classical education tend to be true, good, and beautiful. Beautiful art, beautiful music, beautiful books, beautiful literature, and the artifacts themselves become glorified,
Right.
and people start focusing on the great works and not the telos of Christianizing the culture.
Yeah.
And that's the first problem.
Yes.
And that's a function, I think, of classicism and practices in classicism that were brought forward from the 19th century instead of from the Middle Ages. The second, remind me the second.
Basically the effeminacy.
Oh, the effeminacy,
yes,
yeah.
Right,
Yes, that can be a concern. The funny thing is that in any prior generation, that wouldn't have been much of an issue. I think the second relates to the first. I mean, Middle Ages, not, it's complicated to say anything about education in the Middle Ages because it wasn't for everyone. It was for a select few.
Right.
But you had to be as good of a warrior as you were a thinker.
Right.
And that was certainly true in Greece and Rome, which is why, as they passed their form of education forward, it was very masculine. It was called gymnasium, and still is in Europe. If you want to get an education that'll take you to college, you go to gymnasium. So that's a function of, I don't know, whether it's the feminization of classical education. I don't know too many kids who can read the Wars of the Gauls and, or pick your classical work and not end up just more masculine just for reading
exactly.
it.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, totally agreed. What are you working on at the moment? Anything interesting in the pipeline?
Yeah, I'm working on following the Battle for the American Mind. It's been a long project. It's taken a few years because it's really a field guide to classical education so that people can see, how does this work? We've touched on some things here. How does this work in a real practical K through 12? And that's what that book is. Got some other things. We're continuing to try and expand classical Christian education as fast as the demand, and that is very difficult. We're trying to raise some funds to do that and that sort of thing.
That's excellent. Well, David, it's always good speaking with you. You're one of my favorite people to hang out with, and I really
well, it's
mean
mutual.
It's
mutual.
It's always an adventure with you. So grateful for your friendship. I look forward to more adventure with you down the road.
Yep.
Yeah. How about this? As we end this, I like to end with a toast these days. What can we toast to that's really good today? I'll let you call out the toast.
Okay. Let's toast the teachers.
Yeah. Toast the teachers.
Let's toast the teachers who labor in classical Christian education for the sake of the kids.
Amen. Yeah. Cheers.